Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Andrew Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about my Week 1 tight end rankings for the 2021 fantasy football season. On today's episode, of course, we're covering all topics related to the tight end position, beginning with matchups. We'll talk about which defenses last season were giving up the most points to opposing tight ends on a weekly basis, on average, in a half PPR scoring format, giving you guys some perspective as to which tight ends going into Week 1 have the most advantageous or perhaps the most disadvantageous matchups on the week. After that, of course, we'll talk about my top 16 tight end rankings as I give you guys my opinions as to how I think the tight end position is going to stack up this week, along with the statistics that justify those opinions, and giving you guys a little bit of an extended look at the tight end position. Of course, for those of you who waited on the tight end position and didn't want to invest early and went and bolstered your running back, wide receiver positions, perhaps got an early quarterback, waiting on tight end is going to be a tricky thing, and it's about balancing and figuring out who you can play at the lower end of the spectrum in that 12 to 16 range that could still get you viable fantasy points to help you win throughout the week. That's why we've extended the list to a top 16 in comparison to the typical top 12. Again, we have to remember that rankings are always subject to change. There are always injuries taking place. Earlier, right before I began recording this video, Gus Edwards tore his ACL. Yes, the starting running back of the Baltimore Ravens is out for the season. That is the third Baltimore Ravens running back that has sustained a season-ending injury, beginning with Dobbins, then Justin Hill, then now Gus Edwards. Unfortunately, this is just the nature of the beast. The game of football is going to always entail injuries, and though this happened at practice, we have to adapt. Of course, guys like Tyson Williams, I mentioned him in a video a couple weeks back in regards to maybe somebody that you want to grab at the end of your bench as a flyer option because he has the upside of being an RB2 for the Ravens, who has been a viable option. He and Le'Veon Bell will be potentially splitting snaps. I think this upcoming week it will be a Tyson Williams-led backfield because, again, Le'Veon Bell was just signed. He still needs to learn the offense, still needs to get in full game shape, all of that included. Because he didn't have a preseason of experience. There is a potential that they go out and they trade for a running back, maybe bring Mark Ingram back, maybe go get Latavius Murray, maybe, there's a bunch of options that this team could potentially expend this season. We'll just have to wait and see. But regardless, the reason why I, of course, mentioned the injury is because rankings are subject to change. By the time we get to Sunday, there could be a possibility where somebody gets injured and they're not playing. That's why you can either stay up to date by going to my Patreon down in the description of the video and finding my entire weekly rankings between weeks 1 through 18 every week, of course, with the flex rankings that are only for Patreon users, or you can show up on Sunday mornings, 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, kickoff with Kirchhoff. I'll be talking about setting your lineups and the players that I like, and all of the updated 1 through 36 wide receiver running back rankings, of course, the top 16 quarterback and tight end rankings up to date, so you can make sure that your lineups are set and ready to go for Sunday morning. Outside of that, I, of course, want to thank you guys for the incredible support as of late. Of course, we are continuing to get closer and closer to our goal of 50,000 subscribers, so if you have not yet already, I cannot emphasize how important it is to subscribe to the channel, stay up to date on my latest content, as we'll be producing fantasy football content 7 days a week for the entirety of the season, weeks 1 through 18, making sure that your lineups are set and you have the best possible chance of winning a 2021 fantasy football championship. So click that subscribe button, click the bell notification button, and of course, if you like the daily content and me helping you guys out, make sure you smash that like button. I cannot thank you guys enough for doing so and supporting the channel. All right. Timestamps are down in the description of the video. Do not forget that. Of course, we'll have all 16 tight ends mentioned down there. So if, in fact, you're looking for a specific one and trying to hear my thoughts about them, there it is. Outside of that, let's get into talking about matchups at the position going into week 1. Of course, the graphic to my left shows the strength of schedule for the tight end position as of the 2020 season. Of course, the New York Jets were giving up the most points to opposing tight ends last season. In fact, 15 fantasy points per week on average. Of course, there were a couple games here and there where they take on Kelce and Waller, and of course, those numbers elevated that overall potential average. But to be honest, yeah, the New York Jets were not good last season. Neither were the Chicago Bears, the Cleveland Browns, Atlanta Falcons, Jacksonville Jaguars. Those defenses were absolutely taken advantage of on a weekly basis, and they could potentially fall victim to the tight end position once again this week, and that's what we're trying to exploit. Of course, there are defenses on the other side of the spectrum, like the San Francisco 49ers, the Pittsburgh Steelers, Green Bay Packers, Indianapolis Colts, New England Patriots. I know Bill Belichick, every time he plays against the tight end, typically locks them down, even if it's at the caliber of a Darren Waller or even Mark Andrews, Kelce. He's been able to lock them down throughout his career. That's typically how his defenses function. I just wanted to go ahead and, of course, show you guys what we could potentially be seeing in week 1 of the 2020 season, because there's always a possibility that though there are defensive changes, a lot of these defenses have their main core structure, and guys like the Indianapolis Colts, they're obviously still going to have Darius Leonard and Bobby Okereke. They're going to be their coverage linebackers and potentially covering guys like Gerald Everett this week. That is going to be set in stone. There's not really much there. But when we look at the Las Vegas Raiders taking on Mark Andrews, they've gone ahead in the last couple of weeks. They have adjusted their inside linebacking core. Of course, they brought in KJ Wright. They brought in Denzel Perriman. There are going to be different shifts. And of course, I've taken those into account. Just wanted to go ahead and mention and kind of provide this information to you guys just so that we can reference back to it throughout the video. Outside of that, let's go ahead and let's start talking about my top 16 tight end rankings for week 1 of the 2021 fantasy football season. Guys, I cannot wait. It's a couple hours until kickoff. We finally made it. An entire long offseason of just waiting and waiting for this Thursday night kickoff. I hope it's an exciting game, though I do believe the Tom Brady-led Tampa Bay Buccaneers are going to find a victory this week. I still believe that there's a potential chance for a lot of fantasy success and hopefully a lot of us getting a lot of points tonight and starting our weeks off hot. You always want to do that on a Thursday night. If you can't start off hot, it already looks terrible. But let's get into my top 16 rankings, beginning with my number 1. It is Travis Kelce. I mean, I'm not going to really talk too much about these studs because Travis Kelce is a must-play in every circumstance. You probably invested a late first round, early second round selection on him this offseason, but let's be honest. Travis Kelce last season averaged 17.35 fantasy points per game in a half PPR scoring format. The best amongst all tight ends, and in fact, last season was the third best tight end performance in fantasy football history, was only 0.24 fantasy points behind Jimmy Graham's incredible performance in the early 2010s when he was with the New Orleans Saints. When we look at what Travis Kelce was able to produce in terms of consistency, out of all the weeks, all 15 games that he did participate in last season, of course, he didn't play in the 16th game because they were preparing for the playoffs. Kelce was a top 10 tight end in every single week except for one against the Denver Broncos in week 7 of last season. He was also a top 5 tight end in 10 of those 15 games, and he was the number 1 overall tight end in 5 out of those 15 games that he played last season. Of course, he's the number 1. Shouldn't be a surprise. And again, in the last 10 games of the 2020 season, he even picked up his pace even more, was averaging 20.27. I think going into the 2021 season against the Cleveland Browns, a defense that's given up a lot of points, they've got some rookie linebackers there they're going to have to cover. I think Travis Kelce is absolutely going to be able to take advantage of them. We move on to Darren Waller as our number 2. Again, I know Darren Waller's matchup isn't the greatest, but when we look at what this defense was able to produce last season, I know that there are going to be potential pockets in which Darren Waller is going to be able to produce and find himself success, mainly because this game script is probably going to look like the Las Vegas Raiders having to come from behind for majority of the game. And if in fact that is going to be the case, there are going to be a lot of targets going in the direction of Darren Waller. And what do I always preach in fantasy football? Opportunity leads to success. What looks like opportunity in the eyes of Darren Waller? 7+ targets. In Darren Waller's career, in 22 out of the last 32 games that Darren Waller has played for the Las Vegas Raiders, he has had 7+ targets. In those games, in those 22 contests, he's averaged 15.36 fantasy points per game in a half PPR scoring format. I anticipate Darren Waller to get to that status. I anticipate the targets, the opportunity, and of course the success to be there. He plays against his former team, a team that did cut him, but eventually allowed him to get back on track because of course his personal demons. This could be considered a bit of a homecoming for Darren Waller, but it's not more of a revenge game. It's more of a, hey, I'm going to drop 20 fantasy points on your head. Thank you for believing in me, and now I'm a stud tight end in the National Football League. All right, anyway, we're going to move on to our number 3. We have George Kittle. George Kittle has a fantastic matchup playing against the Detroit Lions defense. We've talked about it all week. Regardless of position, the San Francisco 49ers are in an incredibly advantageous position this upcoming week based on the fact that the Detroit Lions defense is one of the worst, if not the worst, in the National Football League. This team is going to certainly struggle. And even defensively, let's talk about the other side of the ball. Special teams, offensively, they're not going to be able to produce, and it's going to continue to lead to the San Francisco 49ers being put in short field positions and advantageous spots where they're going to get their number 1 potential receiving option involved. Of course, George Kittle did deal with injuries in the last couple of years, but even after coming back from his injury last season, week 16 and 17, he came back with a backup quarterback and put together 2 great performances. In fact, in those 2 games in a half PPR scoring format, put up 11.2 fantasy points and 10.3 fantasy points. Both games in which he had more than 4 catches and more than 68 receiving yards. No touchdowns, but hopefully with the improvement of the quarterback play with Jimmy Garoppolo this week, we could see that take a little bit of a jump in comparison to what we saw last year. But we know that this offense is predicated on getting him the ball, and though he is a run block blocker, and they're going to certainly be succeeding in the run game. There's always the potential for play action, getting this man open, as he is one of the most talented tight ends in the National Football League. In the last 9 weeks of the 2020 season, the Detroit Lions were giving up 13.7 fantasy points per game on average to opposing tight ends. They were just getting completely torched left, right, and center, regardless of who the tight ends they were facing on that given week. They were finding a lot of success against that defense. I anticipate, of course, the San Francisco 49ers and George Kittle to do the same. We move on to our number 4. We have Mark Andrews. And yes, the information that I talked about a little bit earlier on this episode in regards to Gus Edwards is certainly big news for this entire offense as a whole and their potential of getting down the field. But I don't see that as something that is going to completely hamstring them this week. In tougher matchups as the weeks go on, the Baltimore Ravens are going to struggle, and maybe that's going to potentially open up the offense even more to pass the ball. This has been a run-first predicated offense, and though Lamar Jackson is going to be able to scramble and get his yards on the ground, I think that Mark Andrews is definitely going to be an even bigger part of this offense. With the news that there's no J.K. Dobbins and, of course, most recently, no Gus Edwards, I think, of course, Mark Andrews is one of the most talented tight ends in the entire National Football League. Plays against the Las Vegas Raiders. I know they've reconstructed their interior inside linebackers, KJ Wright, Denzel Perriman. They are two of the better coverage linebackers, but in my opinion, there's only one place that the ball goes in the direction of when they get down into the red zone, when this offense is in need of yardage. Lamar Jackson looks for Mark Andrews. There's a reason why the Baltimore Ravens made Mark Andrews one of the highest paid tight ends in the National Football League. They hit him with a big contract the other day, and I think they're going to continue to build on it. The stat that I wanted to mention before we move on from Mark Andrews, considering he is an automatic start in every scenario, is that in the last 2 seasons, week ones, he's produced 20 or more fantasy points both times in a half PPR scoring format. Should be a great week for him this upcoming week. Moving on to our number 5, we have TJ Hockenson. And I understand the matchup is going to be a difficult one. Playing against the 49ers, a team that gave up the fewest points to opposing tight ends last season, it is going to be difficult to potentially swallow and have to start him, but he is a must start at the tight end position. It is just without a doubt in my mind. You have to send him in your lineup. But with that said, with the fact that, of course, Greenlaw, Warner, these are the coverage linebackers that are probably going to be covering him, I still think that Jared Goff is going to be able to get the ball to TJ Hockenson. They're going to be in a negative game script for probably the entirety of this game. And if in fact that's going to be the case, it's very similar to the conversation we had with Darren Waller. Darren Waller looking for 7+ targets. I think that is a very attainable number for TJ Hockenson this week, as Jared Goff is going to be looking anywhere to get the ball to. Of course, going to try to look to a spot either closer to the line of scrimmage, potentially even in the backfield. But I think TJ Hockenson is definitely going to benefit from the fact that this team is going to be throwing for the entirety of the second half of this game. And of course, a lot of the potential passing attempts are going to be targets in the direction of TJ Hockenson. In terms of what the 49ers were able to do to tight ends last year, of course, they completely locked them down. They did not let them score touchdowns. In fact, the most receiving yards a tight end had against the San Francisco 49ers last season was 56 in a singular game. But luckily for TJ Hockenson, the only good news here was that Tyler Higbee was that tight end that had the 56 receiving yards. And who was he aligned with? Jared Goff. And Jared Goff's going to be the quarterback for TJ Hockenson. Of course, hopefully TJ Hockenson can get himself at least 10 fantasy points for us this upcoming week, just based on receptions and the yardage he gains. Maybe a lucky touchdown in garbage time. We have Kyle Pitts as our number 6. Listen, we believe in Kyle Pitts because, again, what this offense is going to be pretty much fundamentally based on. They, of course, want to get a lot of implementation of the tight end position. Arthur Smith did a lot with Anthony Firkser and, of course, Jonnu Smith with the Tennessee Titans. Arthur Smith is a former tight ends coach for the Tennessee Titans prior to becoming their offensive coordinator in the last couple of years. So now that he's with the Atlanta Falcons, I think, of course, they're going to implement a lot of potential usage from Kyle Pitts. And though we did not see him a lot this offseason during the preseason, he's going to be a huge part of this offense. I think there's a potential in which the Atlanta Falcons use Kyle Pitts like the Las Vegas Raiders use Darren Waller. Line him up out wide against cornerbacks and let him just feast. And if not, put him on the end line, let him play in the slot. You can put him anywhere. He's that athletic of a tight end in which he can find a lot of success. This upcoming week, he takes on the Philadelphia Eagles, a defense that, in my opinion, has not been good against the tight end position in terms of their overall fantasy points allowed per game. And, of course, the coverage grades, according to PFF, of those safeties and linebackers that are currently on the team. I think there's a lot of potential for Matt Ryan, Kyle Pitts to find a connection this upcoming week in a matchup that, in my opinion, should be a higher scoring one, considering both of these defenses have been under par in the last couple of seasons, Kyle Pitts should find a lot of success here. Moving on to our number 7, we have Logan Thomas of the Washington football team. Logan Thomas is a very interesting tight end. Of course, in comparison to all tight ends last season, he truly didn't come off the field. He played over 1,000 snaps. He had the most overall snaps amongst all tight ends, even playing more than Darren Waller and Travis Kelce. So, of course, he's an integral part of that offense. He's going to stay on the field and be a huge target for Ryan Fitzpatrick. The statistic that, in my opinion, gives me more confidence, of course, in comparison to the fact that when Mike Gesicki and Ryan Fitzpatrick played together in the past 2 seasons, when Ryan Fitzpatrick was the starter, he targeted Mike Gesicki about 6 times per game. That is a good number. Honestly, if that can just continue to build, especially in a good matchup, which I believe the Chargers are, because when we look at what the Chargers were giving up last season, they allowed 10 touchdowns to opposing tight ends last season. That was like the 4th or 5th most amongst all teams last season between weeks 1 through 17. So if in fact the Chargers, they're not going to be able to cover the tight end position in an offense where, of course, Logan Thomas has proven that he can not only be a threat down the field in terms of down the seam already this preseason with Ryan Fitzpatrick, a huge part of the offense in terms of checkdowns and red zone threat. I think his potential upside just continues to grow based on the matchup. And in this coming week, I like him as my number 7. We move on to number 8. We have Tyler Higbee, another one of these guys that have an incredible matchup on hand this upcoming week. The Chicago Bears is who they play, and on Sunday Night Football, I do anticipate the Los Angeles Rams to blow out this defense. And how are they going to potentially do that? Of course, it's going to be a combination of throwing and running the ball, but ultimately the tight end position is going to be utilized down in the red zone, mainly because the Chicago Bears were not able to stop the opposing tight end position last year. In fact, they gave up the 2nd most touchdowns to opposing tight ends last season, which was a total of 12. And though the matchup is going to be a favorable one for Tyler Higbee, the question is, can we really trust in Tyler Higbee to find the volume of opportunity? Of course, with Matthew Stafford, the amount of success that he found with TJ Hockenson last season, hopefully Sean McVay is going to implement more of an offensive scheme in which they get Tyler Higbee down the field. And I think that's definitely going to be a possibility considering they no longer have Gerald Everett. Gerald Everett going to the Seattle Seahawks. I think there's a possibility that not only is Tyler Higbee in line for a great game in terms of targets and receptions, but he could catch that ever elusive touchdown and solidify himself as a top 8 overall tight end this upcoming week. We move on to Robert Tonyan as our number 9, another tight end that, again, in my opinion, has a favorable matchup. The New Orleans Saints, despite how good of a defense they are in terms of stopping quarterbacks, stopping the run, they really have struggled against the tight end position a lot, and specifically even in the case when playing against Robert Tonyan. When we look at last season's performance of 2020, week 3, Robert Tonyan, 5 targets, 5 receptions, 50 receiving yards, and 1 receiving touchdown against the New Orleans Saints. Last year, in the 15 games that he played, a majority of the offensive snaps, he averaged 10.04 fantasy points per game. He's a huge part of this offense, and even in the NFL playoffs, he was still a part of that offense, scored a touchdown against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Besides being a huge red zone threat for this offense and continuing to score touchdowns on a consistent basis, I think Robert Tonyan just continues to present himself a solid tight end option on this given week. We move on to our number 10. We have Dallas Goedert. Speaking of another solid tight end in a favorable matchup, we have Dallas Goedert playing against the Atlanta Falcons. But the question remains, what are we going to see from this offense? It is definitely going to be a tight end focused offense considering their offensive scheme really doesn't look like anything else. I mean, obviously it was relatively vanilla in the preseason, but in the times that we saw the entire starting offense with Jalen Hurts out on the field, they were targeting the tight end position. They were having a lot of 2 tight end sets, which isn't a surprise considering 2 of their most talented offensive pieces are Dallas Goedert and, of course, Zach Ertz. This upcoming week, I think the matchup is relatively favorable. I know Deion Jones, their middle linebacker for the Atlanta Falcons, is certainly a tougher middle linebacker to catch the ball on over the middle, but ultimately the offense is going to be predicated on getting the ball to the tight end position and getting Jalen Hurts in a comfortable scheme in which he can look to his safety blankets. I think Dallas Goedert is going to be one of them for him this upcoming season. I certainly think there is a potential that if in fact we get Jalen Hurts struggling, of course, he may not even look to throw the ball deep. He may just look for, potential checkdowns or just looking for his tight ends exclusively. That could very much well be the case. We saw, of course, Carson Wentz even look to his 2 tight ends on a consistent basis because oftentimes those wide receivers, especially for the Eagles in comparison to other offense, the Eagles have not had good wide receivers in quite some time. So, of course, they'll look to the tight end position and get Dallas Goedert heavily involved. We have Noah Fant as our number 11. I mean, look, in my opinion, Noah Fant, of course, is a good tight end, but he is still dealing with a calf injury, and that's why we have to keep an eye on him just to make sure that he doesn't get into this game, re-aggravate an injury, and get us in a bad position. Because last season, in the games in which he played fully, of course, didn't leave with an early injury, or at least had an actual starting quarterback. We're not even counting that game against the New Orleans Saints because he didn't have a quarterback in that game. He was a wide receiver at quarterback. But in the games that he fully played, that I'm referring to, he averaged about 8.96 fantasy points per game in a half PPR scoring format. If in fact we get him in an offense where, of course, it's led by Pat Shurmur as their offensive coordinator, they love to target the tight end position. I think Noah Fant can certainly take that next step this upcoming season. And of course, with Teddy Bridgewater as more of a stable quarterback position, you're not going to see as much volatility in terms of turnovers, and you're going to get in the game and get down into the red zone where Noah Fant succeeds the most. In my opinion, Noah Fant is a great option this upcoming week, but we have to keep an eye on him and make sure that he's healthy and ready to go. Because if he's not a full participant by the end of the week, I know he's been limited in practice this week thus far. If he's not a full participant, it may lower his rankings in my eyes. But for right now, I have enough confidence in him to maintain him in the top 12 based on the opportunities that he's going to see in this offense and the potential for upside. Moving on to our number 12, we have Jonnu Smith. Now, I understand that Jonnu Smith may be a touchdown-dependent tight end, but based on everything that we've seen this offseason, the New England Patriots made a statement by going out and signing Jonnu Smith and Hunter Henry. They made a statement saying, we want to reestablish the tight end position in this offense because in the last 2 seasons prior to bringing these gentlemen in, they targeted the tight end position the fewest amount of times in the entire National Football League. So if you go ahead and look at the fact that, yes, you have Mac Jones, a younger, inexperienced quarterback who is most likely going to keep the ball relatively close to the line of scrimmage to him. He's going to look for checkdowns and try to get into a rhythm against the defense like the Miami Dolphins. I absolutely anticipate the potential of Jonnu Smith to be used a lot in this offense, a lot of 2 tight end sets, but of course, Jonnu Smith can even be used out of the backfield. He's an extremely talented and athletic tight end overall, and in my opinion, based on what we were able to see him last season in Tennessee and what he was able to accomplish when healthy, this guy is a touchdown machine. You just got to get him into the red zone, not even in the red zone, get him down the seam and throw the ball over your defenders in between the linebackers and the safeties, and this man will make plays on a consistent basis. I think Jonnu Smith is a fantastic play this week and for the rest of this season. If Mac Jones is up to the par that we anticipate, Jonnu Smith is going to be a huge part of this offense in between the 20s and, of course, down in the red zone when they try to go for that play action. Of course, Damian Harris is going to be threatening a lot of those goal line carries. Jonnu Smith just kind of leaking out into the flat could be a huge option. Moving on to our number 13, we have Rob Gronkowski playing tonight against the Dallas Cowboys. Again, it is an extremely favorable matchup for every single offensive piece of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. That is just a given. But there are so many mouths to feed that we don't know who is going to succeed except for potentially the main trio, right? It's going to be some sort of combination of Mike Evans, Chris Godwin, Antonio Brown, certainly finding success with Tom Brady. The running back position, there's so many to think of. Of course, the tight end position, you have Gronk, you have Brait, you have O.J. Howard. There is a lot of mouths to feed in this offense, and you never know who is going to score that touchdown. But from what we've seen, of course, just even last year, Rob Gronkowski is a big part of this red zone offense. He may just be an exclusive red zone piece like we've talked about in the past, and I think it would be dumb of me not to put him in, especially considering the fact that I think Vegas has this game as a -9.5 in favor of the Buccaneers. They are going to rain points on top of this Dallas Cowboys defense. I think it's just all signs point to potentially playing majority of your Buccaneers players. But as of right now, considering the potential volatility, if he doesn't score that touchdown, we're going to leave him here outside of our top 12 as our number 13. Moving on to number 14, we have Mike Gesicki playing against the New England Patriots. I have my concerns about Mike Gesicki, not because of the fact that him and Tua aren't a great connection. They certainly are. Last season when they played together, Tua targeted him about 6 targets per game on average, and he averaged 9.15 fantasy points per game while together. My issue is with the New England Patriots. New England Patriots only allowed 3 touchdowns to opposing tight ends last season, and in my opinion, based on what we've seen year over year with Bill Belichick's defenses, especially when they're at full form, they do not allow anything to the tight end position. But with that being said, I do believe this offense is going to see a lot of usage of the tight end position. With, of course, one of their co-offensive coordinators being a former tight end coach, they're using Mike Gesicki a lot in the slot position. More than any other tight end in the National Football League, Mike Gesicki plays in the slot in terms of routes run and total snaps played. I think he's a huge part of this offense. And if, in fact, you can get him that 6 target range and potentially into the conversation of getting down into the red zone and finding success there, of course, he has an even greater upside of being better than the number 14 overall tight end. But for as of right now, considering the very difficult matchup against Bill Belichick, in terms of what Mike Gesicki has done in the past against them, he's only had one good game against them. It was at the end of the 2019 season. Even last year, week 1, when he did play against them, the second game he was injured. He didn't find that much success. But ultimately, that was just a blowout in which the New England Patriots kind of took out the Miami Dolphins very early in that game, considering how many interceptions Ryan Fitzpatrick had thrown. So ultimately, a decent option, but my number 14 nonetheless. We have Gerald Everett as our number 15. Eventually, we'll have a Seahawks jersey on him, but for as of right now, we haven't seen much of Gerald Everett in the preseason. But as of this current moment in time, I really do believe that with Shane Waldron, a former offensive coach of the Los Angeles Rams, coming over to the Seahawks and bringing Gerald Everett was intentional. They wanted to bring in a tight end because they knew that they were going to use a tight end significantly in this offense. And when we look at what the Seahawks have done and how much Russell Wilson has used the tight end position in the past, of course, Jimmy Graham is a completely different animal, but we remember the days in which Jimmy Graham was catching 8 to 10 touchdowns in a singular season for the Seattle Seahawks team prior to his departure. And even once he left, we saw Will Disley be a huge part until, of course, his multiple season-ending injuries. They even tried to bring in Greg Olsen last year to be a huge part of this offense. He got injured. I think there's a very good potential in which Gerald Everett, a very athletic tight end. I mean, to be honest, he's more of a wide receiver in a tight end's body, should be a vital part of this offense. And I know Tyler Lockett, Chris Carson, DK Metcalf, those are going to be the first 3 options of this offense. But after those guys, Russell Wilson is certainly going to look to the tight end position. Another guy on the field that can certainly make plays, that is Gerald Everett as our number 15. The final option for this week is Austin Hooper. The reason why I wanted to mention Austin Hooper is, of course, the Kansas City Chiefs. They've given up a lot of points to opposing tight ends over the last couple of years, just off of the statistics in terms of touchdowns that they've given up. There's a potential that Tyrann Mathieu may not even play this week. Anthony Hitchens, which is probably the linebacker that's going to be covering Austin Hooper, isn't great. All in all, it's continuing to look like there's a potential where Austin Hooper could find himself a little niche here and find some success. Specifically because, again, at the back end of the 2020 season, that's when Austin Hooper finally came out and had a great performance consecutively, which he wasn't able to do early on out because David Njoku was there. Of course, Austin Hooper did have appendicitis, had to leave the season midway through and had to recover for a couple weeks. But at the back end of the season, in 4 out of the last 5 games that he played, he scored a receiving touchdown. The performance is 5 catches, 41 yards and a touchdown, 7 catches, 71 yards, 4 catches, 37 yards and a touchdown, 7 catches, 46 and a touchdown. Those are 4 out of those 5 games, getting incredible performance after incredible performance, even going into the NFL playoffs in which he scored a touchdown against the Pittsburgh Steelers. Ultimately, I think Austin Hooper, in terms of all the other tight ends that are available, is one of the better options, considering this team, of course, predicated on running the ball. They want double tight end sets with David Njoku on one side, Austin Hooper on the other. Hooper should end up potentially finding a lot of success and targets from the direction of Baker Mayfield and maybe that ever-elusive touchdown. Those are my top 16 tight end rankings for week 1 of the 2021 fantasy football season. Enjoy Thursday Night Football tonight. Make sure that if you have not yet already, click that like button down below. Comment down below. Let me know what you guys think about today's rankings. Of course, tomorrow we will have our Hidden Gems episode. Don't forget to subscribe. Check out the Patreon down below. Outside of that, enjoy football tonight, and I'll see you guys later. Peace.